Hey everybody, welcome back to class. It's good to see you again. Actually, I'm not seeing you right now. You're seeing me, but I'm not seeing you. I'll see you online. Anyhow, enough of that silliness. This week we're going to talk about something really important in the organizational behavior field, and that is individual differences. Now, we know that God has made each of us unique, right? We're all fearfully and wonderfully made. We all have lots of different attributes that make us different from one another. Now, if you're leading in a workplace context or a ministry context, it's important for you to think about the differences in very specific and tangible ways. So it's one thing to say, yeah, I know people are different, but it's another to have a schema, a set of ideas that help you identify what those differences are and to treat them and lead them in ways that are going to be beneficial to them and to the organization. And so this week we're going to go through a whole set of different kinds of individual differences that have been identified over the years that people have. And so you have them, your people in your ministry have them, and it's important for you to know what they are. So hang on for a whirlwind tour. I'm going to go kind of fast here. Hopefully you've read the chapter on this in your textbook reading, but this will be a good overview and review of this idea of individual workplace differences and how you can more effectively lead by understanding those. So hang on. Individual differences influence work behavior. They have a direct effect on behavior, perceptions, and interactions. And these differences explain why some people, for example, embrace change and others fear it. There's virtually no area of an organization that's unaffected by individual differences. To understand individual differences, we need to observe and recognize differences, study relationships among variables that influence individual behavior. Work behavior is anything a person does in the work environment. Some behaviors contribute to productivity, others are non or counterproductive. So even in a church and ministry setting, you'll see that people respond differently, they act differently. And there's a lot of factors that influence this individual behavior. This slide here shows the 6 main categories of individual differences. And we're going to go through each of these individually. But just to give you an overview, individual differences are considered to be things like diversity, abilities and skills, attitudes, personality, emotions, and perceptions. And we're actually going to have a whole chapter on perceptions. And so you'll see, according to this chart here, that the arrow's pointing in, meaning all these things influence work behavior. So let's take a look at each of these individually, shall we? The first are diversity factors. Now, we all know that in modern society, we have very diverse workplaces. We live in diverse communities, and people from all walks of life are welcome into our workplaces by law and by custom. And so, as we're thinking about the people who work for us, we need to consider the diversity that they bring into the workplace. So some of the primary dimensions and what are considered stable are things like age, ethnicity and race, gender, physical attributes, and sexual orientation. Secondary dimensions, which are considered changeable, are things like education background, marital status, religious beliefs, health, and work experience. Now, just a note here, under primary dimensions, it says that sexual orientation is a stable trait. Some people have argued that sexual orientation can change. People with homosexual tendencies can change those. And we know there's a big, raging cultural debate over this whole thing, right? But I just wanted to point that out, that not everybody believes that sexual orientation is a stable factor. But I think we would probably agree with most of these. Under religious beliefs, we like to believe that people can go from being non-religious to religious, of course. That's one of our primary missions, right, as kingdom workers, is to usher people to have a set of stable religious beliefs, primarily faith in Christ. And that's about all I want to say about this, other than knowing that when people bring these things into the workplace, this is going to impact their attitudes and ability to a certain degree, especially some of these other secondary dimensions, right? Education, you're going to have some highly educated people, you're going to have some low educated people. You're going to have some people with a lot of work experience. You're going to have people with very little work experience, right? So a wise manager doesn't, put the same person, you don't put somebody with a differing work experience in the same position. That just wouldn't make sense. And so that's a factor that needs to be considered as well. Another interesting and more recent issue in diversity in the workplace has to do with generational diversity. And so we now know that the Gen Y folks, or millennials, are quickly becoming the majority in a lot of workplaces. And I bet you there's even a lot of millennials in this cohort. By looking at your pictures, I can tell there are a lot of millennials in this cohort. And then, of course, the older generation are the Gen Xers. And then the oldest generation now are the boomers. Now, 20 years ago, when we started talking about generational issues, we had the elder generation on there, the sort of the World War II generation, but those folks are quickly passing, and you don't see them in the workplace as much anymore. Most of them are in their 80s and 90s by now. So now the baby boomers, hello baby boomers in the class, guess what? You guys are you're the old people in the workplace now. And there's another group too that's starting to impact the workplace. At least in my world of higher education, and that's the Gen Z. And these are your people that are, born in the, in the 2000s. They're actually going into college now, and some of them are starting to get into the workplace. And they're a whole other group, and they're different. It's interesting how we can identify differences of people. The Gen Y people, the millennials, they've been a pretty well researched and studied group by now, and they bring a lot of different characteristics to the workplace. And so for you baby boomers or Gen Xers trying to work with millennials, and you're shaking your heads and you're wondering about their different expectations and attitudes about work itself, you're not alone. So you millennials, you bring a lot of things, a lot of positive things into the workplace, creativity and a sense of individualness and those sorts of things. But keep in mind, you bring a lot of challenge for the more traditional folks in the workplace and even in a ministry context. Then there's disability diversity. And one of the ways as employers and even church leaders, facilities managers, we need to be aware of some of these things, right? And we know we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, which mandates certain things, for example, making facilities accessible. But there's also issues, too, of making jobs, restructuring jobs and making those doable for anybody, modifying work schedules, and job reassignments. So there's a lot of diversity in the workplace. And so this gender, racial, age, and ethnic diversity will bring differences in, for example, values and work ethics and behavioral norms. Miscommunication, insensitivity, ignorance, and hate, hostility may become major concerns. So again, as somebody who's trying to lead a group of people, a diverse group of people, you need to be aware of some of these things. And it doesn't mean you cater to every different group, especially or uniquely, but you are understanding, you are considerate, you take points of view into consideration, and you try to make your workplace as amicable to everybody who comes into your and let's face it, the kingdom of God is a diverse place, and a lot of us are going to be surprised when we get to heaven and we realize that they're not all singing in English, right? We don't know what the heavenly language will be like, but there's going to be a lot of folks in heaven, and it's part of God's creativity, His infinite wisdom to have created such a diverse workplace. And as kingdom workers, we need to be responsive to the diversity of folks that are coming into our churches that He's asked us to minister to. Okay, so the next individual difference are what are called abilities and skills. An ability is a person's talent to perform a mental or physical task, which is generally stable over time, as opposed to a skill, which is a learned talent, and it is acquired in order to perform a task. So let's break these down a little bit more. So mental ability, these are things like one's verbal fluency and comprehension. You might even say maybe their reasoning skills, their cognitive ability, things like intelligence, etc. Inductive and deductive reasoning, associative memory, spatial orientation, right? So these aren't usually things, that we're thinking about people when we look at them. Oh, I wonder what their spatial orientation is. But, you're going to realize that people bring these different abilities to play into any sort of work, ministry context, volunteer context as well, right? Tacit knowledge are work-related practical know-how acquired through observation and experience. And so, a lot of folks, especially in many ministry contexts, bring in this tacit knowledge of things that they've learned. They didn't really go to school for it. And we all have things. We all have knowledge that we've acquired over years from different work experiences. And it's practical know-how, and we've gained it over time. There's a theory here by Steinberg. He believes that leaders and managers with practical intelligence. So what's a practical intelligence? That would be somebody with this sort of tacit knowledge that's built up in time. He believes that they tend to capitalize on their own strengths and overcome weaknesses, realize that they're not good at everything, overcome negative expectations set by others around them, learn from their positive and negative experiences, and have a can-do attitude, right? So this is a very important sort of intelligence to develop, and I believe that this can be a learned skill. And, we might call this, back in the day, we might have called this street smarts, right? People who can understand how to get things done. They didn't necessarily have to go to school for it or read it in a book per se, but they had this practical intelligence. But part of it means that they know what they don't know. Now, it's good to be, street smart in a sense, but sometimes those folks don't necessarily see their own limitations. Now, you guys are all in school. I understand you probably have some street smarts, but you also want to expand your capacity, sort of your academic ability, and expose yourself to more things to enhance your ability and skills. Now, attitude. What's an attitude? Well, sometimes we think of this sort of the popular conception of an attitude as like, well, he had a bad attitude, or, she was sporting a tude, or something like that, right? We sort of use attitude to mean a negative disposition. Now, attitudes can be negative, but when we talk about attitudes and organizational behavior, we're talking about a little bit broader set of cognitive abilities here. They're determinants of behavior because they're linked to perception, personality, feelings, and motivation. So an attitude is a mental state of readiness which is learned and optimized through experience. And so there's several components of attitudes. One is cognition, a person's perceptions, opinions, and beliefs. Affect, which is the emotional component of attitudes, learned from parents, teachers, and peers. So affect is a term you're going to see a lot in the OB and other literature. It really means emotions. And then behavior, the tendency to act in a certain way towards someone or something. Another associated idea is what's called cognitive dissonance, which is a discrepancy between attitude and behavior. And it creates discomfort which individuals attempt to reduce or eliminate. For example, knowing that smoking is bad for your health, but continuing to smoke, right? That creates a cognitive dissonance. And so people have all sort of mental strategies that they use to reduce the cognitive dissonance. You would say, oh, well, why doesn't he just quit smoking? Well, he's addicted, that's why. And so he will say something like, oh, I'll quit smoking next month. Or, not everybody gets lung cancer. My grandpa smoked till he was 90 years old, and he did just fine. So we have all these sort of rationalizations that we use in order to overcome cognitive dissonance. Sometimes we have cognitive dissonance in a ministry or workplace when we see unethical behavior. We'll see people engaging in it, maybe even leaders, and we say, whoa, wait a minute, what's going on there? But we don't say anything, we don't do anything, and this creates a lot of cognitive dissonance, doesn't it? And so we make certain rationalizations like, well, it's not that bad, or other people do things, or what about our own unethical behavior, right? Especially as Christians, we have the Holy Spirit telling us inside, hey, that's wrong, hey, that's wrong. Maybe it doesn't sound like that to you, but that's what he sounds like to me. And so that creates a certain amount of cognitive dissonance when we know something's wrong, and the Spirit's telling us something's wrong, but we go ahead and do it. And sometimes we rationalize, we say, well, they really owed that to me, so it's okay if I, take that computer, or I take that thing from the church, or if I, take an extra day off that I don't have owed to me, etc., etc. So unethical behavior can lead to a lot of cognitive dissonance. And perhaps that's when it's time to repent and get straight and fess up for anything. But this is something that people have, right? This is a workplace attitude and disposition. So this chart here shows how these things work together, and sort of an example of how we sort of go through things. So there's work stimuli factors, for example, a manager's style, peers, rewards, etc., etc. So our cognitive has to do with our beliefs and values, and we think things like, my supervisor's unfair. And our value is having a fair supervisor is important to me. So how does that affect our affect? That's our feelings and emotions. We say, I don't like my supervisor. And so our behavior says, I've submitted a formal request for transfer. Now your behavior could also say, I don't like my supervisor, but I'm going to stick around. And what's that going to cause? That's right, cognitive dissonance, right? So you see how these things work together. We have the belief that things should be a certain way, but they're not a certain way, and we somehow rationalize sticking around in order to, and this isn't always a bad thing, right? Sometimes we have these feelings, and they're passing feelings. Maybe we didn't like the way our boss spoke to us at a particular meeting, but that's an outlier. She's not usually like that. He's not usually like that. And we talk to them the next day about it and say, hey, can we talk about what happened in the meeting yesterday? And you kiss and make up, and everybody's just fine, and you don't want to quit anymore, right? So, you don't have to live with a state of cognitive dissonance if you can kind of move on and, do the right thing and have your relationships go smooth. All right, so what's the connection between attitudes and job satisfaction? Well, actually, job satisfaction is considered an attitude. It's an attitude towards a job that results from a perception of the job and the fit between the worker and the organization. So what is job fit? I think we talked about this early on in the class. It's the fit between one's background, abilities, passions, desires, abilities, etc., and the role that they're playing in a particular work context. So job satisfaction will stem largely from this perception that we make a good organizational fit. And last week we talked about culture. Sometimes you might come into a workplace, a ministry context, and have a certain expectations of what it's going to be like, and the culture is completely different. And so our attitudes towards that job is wrong. And we might say, oh, I'm going to change this, but we realize that culture doesn't change easily, and just because you showed up doesn't mean it's going to bend to your will. So we kind of feel stuck, and we realize that it's a bad person fit excuse me, with our skills and backgrounds and expectations and the culture of the organization. And so this will diminish our job satisfaction. So factors that have been associated with job satisfaction include things like pay, the work itself, promotion opportunities, supervision, coworkers, work conditions, and job security. So job satisfaction is typically in the OB literature considered the ultimate dependent variable, right? So everything else that we change in a workplace context really is to improve job satisfaction, at least from a human relations perspective. Obviously, we know that there's things like strategy that are important, and structure and policies and those sorts of things. But from an HR perspective, in terms of people and the people that we deal with, job satisfaction is an important one. And people, so if their attitude, they have a bad attitude about their job, perception of bad job fit, etc., it can lead to low job satisfaction. So what are some of the implications for managers and leaders? Well, attitudes are learned, They define one's predispositions. They're the emotional basis of interpersonal relations and identifications with others. They're closely linked to personality, which we'll talk about next. And they're subject to change, right? So if somebody has the wrong attitude and they're feeling their job satisfaction is low, they can be changed, right? So we can help them to, find the right fit, etc., etc. All right, next we're going to talk about personality. Now this is an important one, and some of you might be familiar with this concept a bit. Personality can be defined as a relatively stable set of feelings and behaviors that have been significantly formed by genetic and environmental factors. Okay, so genetic and environmental means you may have just inherited certain personality characteristics from your forefathers and foremothers. And then the environmental factors are things that you've learned from your environment growing up. And so the way it was in your household, the culture you came from, etc., are going to be determinants of personality. It has to do with the relationship between behavior and personality is complex. Principles of personality generally accepted as true are these. Personality has observable, measurable patterns. Personality has superficial aspects such as attitudes towards being a team leader. There is a deeper core such as sentiment about having a stronger work ethic. And personality involves both common and unique characteristics. So personality in OB, following World War II, many researchers believe that personality testing could predict job performance. The validity of these tests is questionable. And there was fear that these tests discriminated against minorities. But many companies today still use tests in selection, career planning, training, and team assignments. The Myers-Briggs inventory is very popular. And I think Myers-Briggs is used at the front end to figure out if somebody is a good fit for a job. And it's also used in team development and training, right? So if we understand, because people with different personalities contribute differently in an organization. So, for example, your height, well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but we'll talk about that in just a minute. But knowing your people's personality very explicitly through taking something like Myers-Briggs can help you figure out why things are working or why things aren't working in their particular job assignment. Now, another way of looking at personality is through what's called the Big Five personality dimensions. And so I'm going to explain each of these, and I'm going to kind of give some examples of how these are related to work behavior and job assignment and fit and those sorts of things. Now, you can think of each of these five on a scale, on a continuum, from high to low, which sort of leads into another personality dimension, right? So, for example, extroversion. Extroversion is the ability to be satisfied and happy and productive in a group of people. You like people, you like hanging out with people, you get energy from being with people. As opposed to introversion, which is people who are more comfortable in the life of the mind, of thinking, of being alone, of being creative, being engaged in things like that. So then there's sort of a halfway point too. They've discovered a new, new dimension here, which is called the ambivert. A-M-B-I-V-E-R-T. These people are sort of right in the middle, right? They're okay with people, but they're also, a bit intellectual, and they like to do their own creative thing from time to time as well. And again, the best way to determine this that I've discovered is thinking about where you get your energy from. So people who are extroverts get their energy from being with people. They love to be the life of the party. They want to stick around. They love talking to other people, on the phone or in person. They just kind of get psyched up by doing that. As where if you're an introvert, doing that a lot kind of is draining. Now, I tend to be like that. I'm an introvert, and so I love my classes. I love being in the classroom. I love being with people, but at the end of the day, I'm tired, and I need to go home, play my guitar, read a book, something like that. The next one is emotional stability. Now, this used to be called, and I think it still is in some places, neuroticism, right? So people who are highly neurotic, that'd be the opposite of emotional stability, tend to be angry, bad mood, right? Mood swings, depressed, those sorts of things. Agreeableness are folks who, like to say yes. They don't tend to argue a lot, as opposed to being disagreeable, right? A disagreeable person, you could say, hey, it's a nice day out. Well, yeah, but it's going to get bad later. I want to go eat Chinese food. No, let's go eat Mexican food, right? Somebody who's agreeable, hey, let's go to Chinese food. Hey, that sounds good to me. Hey, let's go see this movie. Hey, that sounds good to me, right? So they don't disagree a lot. Conscientiousness, the best definition I've heard of that is somebody who focuses on few goals. Somebody who's highly conscientious is not trying to do too much. It's like that old vaudeville act of the guy spinning the plates, right? Where he gets 1 plate up, 2 plates up, 3 plates up, 5 plates, 10 plates, right? And he's spinning all these plates, and eventually, they'll come crashing down. Well, that's the non-conscientious person, right? They're just trying to do too many things at a time. Highly conscientious people, they focus on a few things and they do them well. These people tend to make good managers because they're organized, they're detail-oriented, and they don't take on more than they can handle. And then there's openness to experience. And these are people that are creative, they like change, they like risk, they like doing new things. We'll talk more about creativity in a bit, but then the opposite of that would be what? They're not people that aren't open or people who are closed. These people don't like change, they don't like risk, they like predictability and order. Typically, these people also make good managers as well. Typically, leaders are more open, right, because they like risk, they like change, and they like possibility thinking and those sorts of things. So, no trait or group of traits predicts how well someone will perform on a project or job. However, as we mentioned, some personality traits are better suited for certain jobs than other jobs. Additional selection tools are things like structured interview, cognitive ability tests, and work performance tests. This chart here sort of summarizes things and shows associated work behavior. And I kind of went over some of these, so you can take a look at this as well. Another individual difference is called locus of control, the degree to which one believes that their behavior influences what happens to them. So people with an internal locus of control believe that their good performance is due to their effort or skill. External locus of control people believe that they're controlled by outside forces over which they have little, if any, control. So, right, you might think of the externals as sort of like, quote unquote, fatalists, right? Things that happen, well, it was meant to happen. As opposed to internals are people more with a can-do attitude. Yes, we can do this if we put our minds to it. Yes, I can do that if I work hard, right? So some people, maybe they try to get a job or they try to get something done and it doesn't happen. And they say, well, I guess, the manager didn't want me or they didn't like me, or I'm a bad person or whatever. Internals would say, well, I guess I just didn't work hard enough. Something that I did, didn't open the door for me. So let's see if I can improve that, right? They believe that good performance can open up those kinds of doors. So this is an important thing to know, whether one's an internal and external. Next one is self-efficacy. This is learned and generally task-specific personal beliefs regarding competencies and abilities. It has 3 dimensions: the magnitude, the strength, and the generality. Feelings of self-efficacy can affect selections, decisions, training programs, goal setting, and performance. So somebody who has high self-efficacy believes that they can get stuff done. And this idea came out from the educational literature, and they found that kids who believed that they could do good on a test, guess what? Actually did better than kids who didn't believe they could do good on a test. So think of that old kids book, the Little Train Who Could. Is that what it's called? The Little Train Who Could? I forgot his name, but he's the guy who's going up the hill and he says, I know I can, I know I can't, I know I can, I know I can, I think I can, I think I can, I know I could, right, as he goes over the top of the mountain, right? So that's what you call self-efficacy, this belief that you can get things done. And this is the kind of thing that we can actually help people with in the workplace. You might have somebody who you're trying to train them on a new assignment and they say, I can't do that. So what do you do to help them? Well, you give them a small bit of it and you say, here, why don't you just try this task right here? So let's just say you want them to run, a certain ministry. Say you want them to start a new outreach ministry. I can't do that. I've never done it before. That's scary. That's a lot of work. I'll tell you what, here's what I want you to do. I want you to send out an email to these 20 people. I want to invite them to a meeting and see if they're interested. Oh, okay, I can do that. And the 20 people show up. And you say, well, why don't you run the meeting? And you say, well, they say, oh, I can't do that. I can't do it. Well, tell you what, I'll do most of it, but I want you to come up and talk for 10 minutes at the end. And you bring them up for 10 minutes and they talk and they're like, wow, I could do that. Okay, so what are you doing? Now, you're letting them succeed at smaller tasks, and that builds up our self-efficacy. So once we've done a task and we say, oh, it was no big deal, I can do this, right? So if you're trying to train somebody who has low self-efficacy, give them a small bit of the task and let them succeed at that, and give them ever increasing responsibility, and you'll watch them do better. Okay, so creativity. Let's talk about creativity. This is kind of a hot idea in the OB world these days, and it's believed to be a personality trait. It's the ability to break away from habit-bound thinking and produce novel and useful ideas. It produces innovation, which is the lifeblood of corporations, and I would say churches, and can be encouraged and developed by giving people the opportunity and freedom to think in unconventional ways. Okay, so we talked about the personality attribute of openness before. It's believed that creative people are open. They want to try new things. They have this, tendency and desire, to do new things. So, how can we develop creativity in employees or volunteers, as the case may be? Well, encourage everyone to view old problems from new perspectives, right? So you have to set the tone, right? Remember we talked about leadership and culture last week? Leaders model the kinds of behavior, and they get the kind of culture that they model. And so when you look at things in a new way and you encourage other people, you're going to develop a more creative type of culture. Provide as many people with as many new experiences as possible. Make certain that people know it's okay to make mistakes. Now, this is a challenge for a lot of people, especially if you're one of those highly conscientious people, right? Highly conscientious people don't want to make mistakes. And so it's difficult for them to let people know. It's difficult for them to make a mistake, and it's like impossible for them to tolerate somebody else making a mistake. But guess what? If somebody makes a mistake and you punish them, or do you think they're going to take a risk and do something like that again? No, they're not. Are they going to be creative? No, they're not. And so if you want to develop a culture of creativity, you have to let people know that it's okay to fail once in a while. Now, don't let them, bankrupt you or, ruin lives or anything like that. But as is wise and as prudent, let people make measured risks in order to let them know that it's okay to be creative. And then, of course, set an example by your own approach to dealing with problems. All right. So I just talked about this. Now, by the way, there's a good series of articles in the October 2019 Harvard Business Review. It's called The Business Case for Creativity. And I would encourage you to pick that up if you're really interested in this topic. Like I said, this is a hot topic right now. And I believe that a lot of churches could benefit from more creativity thinking, from more possibility thinking. Churches, let's face it, we get stuck in ruts. We get stuck in traditions, and we're not really good at empowering, letting people try new creative things, right? I don't think that helps the church, to be quite honest. So let's try to develop more creative culture, shall we? All right, and the final topic we're going to talk about here is emotions. Now, we know that people are emotional beings, and when they show up, they don't just leave their emotional baggage at the door, but they bring it in. When you see your staff, when you see your volunteers and see your leaders come in, just imagine they're carrying a couple of emotional suitcases with them, right? Good ones, bad ones that are going to help them, ones that are going to hinder them. So emotions are defined as a state of psychological arousal accompanied by changes in facial expressions, gesture, posture, subjective feelings, and they play an important role at the workplace. And as we talked about the development of OB, initially it had to do with task accomplishment. Remember the idea of scientific management and Weber and Foyle, those kinds of guys. Well, once the whole scientific management fad ended and guys like Stogel and others sort of ushered in Kurt Levine ushered in this whole idea of understanding that people were important, people's feelings, their ability to contribute. These are all important to productivity as well, not just, using the right shovel, but how they felt about, digging in the first place, their ability to contribute. And so emotions now became fair game for understanding as a workplace. Now, again, ministry and church, we're highly relational. We understand. We're kind of emotionally sensitive people, generally speaking. So this isn't brand new news to a lot of us, right? But it's important to understand that when you're dealing with your people, they're not just rational, job doers. You're not just hiring them to accomplish a task like a cog in a machine, but you're hiring them with their feelings and perceptions and attitudes and all those sorts of things. So some of the primary emotions, things like surprise, joy, anticipations, acceptance, fear, sadness, disgust, anger. Moods are the mildest forms of emotions, right? So if somebody gets excited, right, that's an emotion, but it can pass quickly. Or if they get a little bummed, it's a mood, and it will change in time, right? So that's sort of the difference between emotions and moods. Moods are a little more subject to change. Emotions can be more pervasive, right? Things like anger, right, or sadness. And then, if it gets real pervasive, it turns into a funk or whatever. Now, let's talk about emotional labor. Now, this is something that I believe is very relevant in ministry because, let's face it, we bring our hearts and our souls to our work, and we deal with a lot of emotionally taxing issues. If you're a pastor, you deal with some pretty serious situations, don't you? You deal with people and family crises. You deal with deaths in family. You deal with, ministering in tragedy, right? So there's a lot of emotional labor that takes place in ministry, and we put a lot of ourselves into our jobs, don't we? So when we're preaching from the heart, when we're appealing to people, when we're praying with people, that's all emotionally heavy stuff. And that's what's called emotional labor. And we have to be able to manage our emotions in order to perform our job. Now, this next slide may be a little debatable here. It may involve enhancing, faking, or suppressing emotions to modify the emotional expression. Now, we typically want to be authentic. We don't like to fake emotions. But sometimes we do need to suppress and manage emotions. We'll talk about emotional intelligence in a minute here. But in order to maintain a situation. Managing emotions is stressful and may result in burnout. Okay, so this is the biggest drawback, and burnout in ministry is a big deal. You probably know that. And so if you deal with a lot of emotional situations in your work, you need the time to refresh. And Archibald Hart has written a lot on burnout in ministry. I'd encourage you, if that describes you, you might want to pick up one of his books. Now, emotional intelligence is something that's got a lot of press in the last 20 years or so. It refers to the ability to be self-aware of your feelings, manage emotions, motivate yourself, express sympathy, and handle relationships with others. And it's typically believed that people with high emotional intelligence are more successful on the job, and especially as leaders, right? There's some connections in the literature and the research between EI and leadership competency. And that's because we know that a lot of leadership has to do with controlling ourselves, motivating other people, being sympathetic, empathetic, those sorts of things. And the interesting thing about EI is it's believed to be a skill that we can actually learn and grow in it. And so the dimensions of emotional intelligence are things like self-awareness, right? So this has this idea that you know what your triggers are, if you're getting angry, if you're getting depressed, and you're able to control that to a certain degree. And there's a certain physiology behind our emotions, right? So if you're in a meeting, let's just say one of your coworkers, and they always kind of press your buttons, and this person's going to get you mad, and then all of a sudden they say something, you're like, oh, there they go again. And you feel your heartbeat racing, and you feel your blood pressure going up, and you're getting a little warm, maybe even a little sweaty, and you just want to lash out at them, reach across the table and just punch them. Or some people have a different reaction. Some people they get offended or they're with somebody and they'll shut down and they'll clam up. They won't say anything. They don't lash out in anger. They sort of close up, and their little turtle head kind of backs into their shell. And my feelings were hurt and I'm not going to say anything more in this meeting, right? So being self-aware says, okay, I'm offended. Okay, I'm hurt. But I'm not going to check out. I'm not going to lash out. I'm going to be an adult and mature. I'm going to persevere, and I'm going to get a handle on my emotions. Now, is that easy? Not necessarily, but it all starts with being aware. And so I encourage you all to practice awareness of your emotional state, especially in situations that are stressful, stress-inducing, the kind of pinch points and people pinch points, in your lives and in your ministries. Socially aware, being aware of the context around you, managing yourself, I sort of talked about that. And then relationship management, being aware of other people's feelings, Like, just say, a staff member comes in and you've got a meeting with them, and they sit down, they just kind of got this stressed look on their face, and they look a little depressed, and you just like, okay, here's what we got to talk about. Here's the 5 things I need you to do today. And they're just like on the verge of tears. You got to take a minute, Mr. Leader, and say, hey, what's going on? You don't look right. What's going on, man? Can we talk? Can we pray? Just being aware of other people and their emotional state. And that is emotional intelligence, and that's the end of our slide deck. Well, wasn't that something? Now you have a good idea of what all the individual differences are, and how as a leader you can use those things, that you can help people. Let's face it, ministry is all about people, right? And so if you want to help people, you got to know what makes people tick. You got to know what makes them different. You have to know how God has designed them. You have to be sensitive to their experiences and to their backgrounds and their cultures and their attitudes and their emotional state, right? And you have to be able to be sensitive, and you have to help them fit in to the ministry, into the organization in a way that makes sense. So does this make your life more complex? It might. It might. This may change your whole paradigm. Just remember, one size does not fit all when it comes to leadership. And especially in those interpersonal interactions, right? You can't tailor, an entire organization or ministry around 1,000 different people. But when you're talking to people one-on-one, when you're ministering to people, when you're trying to help people find their particular fit, right? This will help you. Now, we also know that there's, the spiritual, intangible, individual differences, right? Things like passion and calling and those sorts of things. And those are important as well. But I just want you to take this whole idea into your thinking about how you're going to deal with, minister to, and lead individuals in your organization. So online this week, we'll have some great opportunities, some great discussion questions that will help you think about these things, process them, and apply them in a ministry context. So blessings to you all. We'll see you all online.